Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Division, which isn't a game that we've been talking about recently because there's been nothing going on with this game recently until now, where they released the survival expansion. All of the footage you're seeing in the background is from survival. We're going to primarily talk about that. But the reason we hadn't been talking about The Division is, again, because nothing has been happening. The last thing they released was the underground expansion, which I thought was fantastic. It's basically a set of procedurally generated dungeons, kind of like Rifts in Diablo. And I like Rifts in Diablo, and it works well in The Division. It was primarily, end game content, which was great because the game needed it. But since then, they've been pretty quiet because they've been working on redoing a lot of how the base game works and rebalancing things. And with the 1.4 patch, they did a really good job of making that base game a lot more enjoyable. So if you hadn't picked up The Division, now might be the time to actually do it because it's kind of worth it now, and the game is way more playable, and all of the issues that a lot of people were having at launch aren't really there anymore. And now the game has a ton of end game content too, so once you get to max level, you actually have stuff to do. But if you hadn't picked up the game, I think the story for the 1 to 30 experience is really good, and the experience of that story is also very good. So I enjoy it. I would highly suggest it. Though if you're not into shooters or anything that has to deal with the Tom Clancy universe, which tends to be fairly realistic, then maybe you're not really into it. I would just say do your investigation before picking up the game. Especially now that we're in the holiday season and the game is pretty cheap, including the season pass, which is how you get these expansions. So one of the things they changed with the base game in 1.4 is they made it at max level. The game has these world tiers. So the world, as you jump into it, has different difficulty levels that you can set it at based on your gear level. And that means that as you're playing, the game will be dropping equivalent level loot for the difficulty of content you're doing. So, for example, I came back to the game. I had item level 229 gear. They added up to 256. So I set my world tier to the max. And in doing content, now I'm getting 256 gear, so I'm getting the max level gear. Whereas if you had just hit level 30, your world tier would be a little bit lower, but you would be getting equivalent gear for what you needed to do in order to get up to the next world tier, if that makes any sense. So it actually makes the base game, again, a lot more playable. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about survival. So how does survival work? Well, first of all, it's a standalone mode that you don't need to be max level for. In fact, if, again, you picked up the game right now, you could play for about an hour, which will unlock your base of operations. And once you've played for about that hour to unlock the base of operations, you can just go start doing the survival mode, which I find a lot more enjoyable than the rest of the endgame content at the moment, mostly because it's new and it's exciting and fun. But I would still suggest going back and doing the story content instead of just farming all of this stuff out. But it is a nice little distraction regardless. And the reason you can do that at whatever level is because it equalizes everybody who goes into it. You basically go to the base of operations. It's a little elevator that brings you down into it. You click on the elevator and it pops up like queuing options. So you queue up for this mode and it asks you whether or not you want to do PvE or PvP, which is really cool considering the base game, when it first launched, had a lot of hacker issues in PvP, in the Dark Zone in particular. Since then, those have been cleaned up a bit, but they still do exist, so I personally enjoy the PvE version of this a little bit more than PvP, because I just don't want to have to deal with any hackers at all, especially on PC. But as you go through, you start off with, jumping into the story. It gives you a quick little video where basically you need to get to the Dark Zone in this little story thing here to pick up these antiviral stuff. And as you're doing it, a crazy storm starts happening. Your helicopter ends up going down and you're basically left scattered away from everybody else with nothing. From what I can tell, it's a 28-player thing. And it spawns you randomly. The reason I say that is because I've spawned in with 20 people, I've spawned in with 24 people, I've spawned in with 28. I don't think I've ever seen 30, but generally speaking, what it does is it takes all of those people, let's just say for the sake of easy numbers, it says 30, and it spreads you throughout the entire map. And I'm not talking, one part of New York. I'm talking like if you opened up the Division map when you got to like the main thing and you zoomed out, it spreads you throughout the entire thing along the edge as an edge. So in the middle, you still have the Dark Zone, and that is your end goal. You need to get to the Dark Zone in order to find these antivirals that you're here to get in the first place. And there are some sub goals. You need to create a virus filter, a filter mask, or mask filter. There we go. For your character to get into the Dark Zone. And then once you're in the Dark Zone, you need to find the antivirals, which will show up on your map when you're in there, but they spawn randomly. So sometimes you'll get really lucky and they'll be close by. Sometimes you won't, and they'll be next to a ton of really mean enemies. And then once you find the antivirals, you need to craft a flare gun or craft it before. And then you need to get the antivirals and extract out of the Dark Zone, just like you normally do in the base game when you're in the Dark Zone. So that's generally what you're doing. That's your goal. You get to the Dark Zone, you find the antivirals, make sure you craft a filter, make sure you craft a flare gun, extract the antivirals, and then you're done. But what you're dealing with during all of this is having to survive, and that's obviously is where the name of the expansion comes from. And it combines elements from separate survival games, like H1Z1, Ark, and even a little bit of DayZ is thrown in there for good measure. Because, you're in the middle of this storm, which is they pretty much just like jump the shark here, just saying like it's the worst storm ever, which is why you're freezing to death. So you need to find gear that is going to keep you warm. And by doing that, you just look around the world. There'll be like little boxes and stuff that you're looting. All of this is procedurally generated loot. But as you're going through, you're finding this appearance stuff. It's not actual like gear, like a holster or backpack. That stuff provides actual stats, but you are finding that as well. Instead, you're finding this appearance gear, which you then equip, and it all has different levels of protection from the cold on it. And by finding this stuff, you'll be able to stay outside longer because you'll be getting cold less, but you'll need to, without it, you find fires or shelter to keep yourself warm. So you're like jumping between fires and shelters until you get enough gear where this becomes less of an issue. So while it's kind of a very immediate fear when you first get into the mode, as you go through it, it becomes less of an issue because you kind of get protection from the cold as you go. But it's the first immediate fear. After that, you only start with a pistol, so you need to find better gear because as you get closer and closer to the Dark Zone, enemies will get more and more difficult to kill, especially in the Dark Zone. So you'll be needing to find better weapons and just better loot in general to make sure that you do damage. But throughout all this, you're finding these safe houses, which are generally the same safe houses that you find, or at least area-wise, in the base game. And you're going through and crafting gear in these safe houses. So either you're crafting cold stuff, you're crafting weapons, or you could even be crafting modifications for your weapons, like different clips and scopes, and just, the general stuff that you get in the Division to begin with. And on top of all that, you're having to deal with the fact that your character needs food and water because as you're running around, you're getting hungry and thirsty. So you have to deal with that. But the worst part of all of this is that your character is now infected, and it literally puts a timeline on your life, because you have to use medicine and painkillers and stuff to reduce the effects of the virus, but you will not be able to survive forever. About the max amount of time that you could survive if you were being pretty liberal with your use of medicine, you were finding a lot of it, is roughly 2 hours before your character would just like straight out die. That said, you probably won't last 2 hours in this mode anyways. At this point, of recording this video, I have gotten to the antivirals. I had the flare gun. I died literally right next to the antivirals due to shotgunners, which are still overpowered in the game. And I essentially just needed to pick those up, and my extraction point was like right next to it, so I would have been able to get out. And that was about 45 minutes. So I would say if you're lasting 2 hours, either you're being very, very careful, or you've just gotten very unlucky with your gear and you're kind of, trying to stretch it out as much as you can. But 2 hours appears to be about the maximum amount of time. So you are having to deal with the fact that you are infected, which means that the time limit on the mode does exist. So you're having to be quick about everything, which is why in the background you see me like run around and deal with my inventory very quickly. So the more you do this mode, the quicker you're going to get at it, because the quicker you'll recognize where loot will be. Sometimes you'll crash near the helicopter crash and you'll be able to go and loot the stuff around the helicopter. The problem is you're having to deal with the fact that there's other players in this mode. Despite, whether or not you have PvP on, you're still having to compete with the loot, because they can see all the loot that is dropping off of whatever you're killing. So if you kill an enemy and a really cool piece of gear drops and you're like, oh, I need that right now, and you start running over to it, but a player beats you to it, they can pick it up because they see it as well, and then it's gone. Likewise, with all of the boxes and stuff in the world, they can see those boxes and they can go and pick that stuff up. If you loot something and you leave it there, they can pick it up. And likewise, if enemies drop, anything, they can go and pick it up. So you are on a timeline. If you drop near the helicopter crash and you want to run over there and pick up the pretty good gear that is there, if you're playing the PvP mode, expect other players to be there. Think of it like the cornucopia in Hunger Games. So you're going to need to defeat whoever else wants that gear as well. And if you're not in PvP, then you're basically having to beat them there in order to get the gear. And sometimes you'll find some players that are pretty nice about it and will leave boxes for you, or will just like leave gear around that they don't need, and you'll be able to pick that stuff up even if they beat you there. But a lot of the time, they're just going to pick everything else up, and you're having to compete with that, because all of it is time wasted if you're not picking stuff up that you actually need, whether it be stuff to make your character warmer or stuff just to keep your character surviving, like medicine, or just general like weapons and armor. That said, the game is got a little bit of that, what's the best way to put it? It does feel very Hunger Games-like, in the way that as you're going through the mode, you're seeing the thing pop up and it being like, there are now 20 players remaining, and it says in the corner, it's like so-and-so died to the cold, or so-and-so died to an NPC, and it's just like telling you this kind of thing. And if you're in the PvP mode, it's like so-and-so killed this other player, and it's cool because it does pop up like the 20 enemies or 20 people now remaining. And it gives you that sense of urgency that, yeah, this is a difficult mode and people are dying in it. All this together means that the game is really fun. The game mode works really well for what it is. And just generally speaking, it does a very good job of giving you that sense of urgency, that sense of, I need to get to the dark zone. I need to get there as quickly as possible and find as much gear as I can. And the fact that every time you play it, you're spawning in a different spot. Sometimes you'll spawn in a similar spot, but you won't be getting the same loot. So you'll need to go to different areas, and maybe you'll need to take a lot of risks and chances about where you're going. Maybe you'll need to go defeat some pretty hard enemies in order to try to get their gear, or risk trying to kill them despite the fact that you may not be geared for it, because you need the stuff out of there to be able to survive in the dark zone. The enemies in the dark zone are no joke, and some of them get really aggressive, so you'll need to, again, have the gear for it, have the weapons for it, have upgrades on your weapons, and most of all, have stuff to keep you alive, because you go into this having no skills. You have to get items like electronics and tools and stuff in order to unlock your skills. So it's difficult, but it is really fun. And I've played it probably about 10 times now. I've gotten close once. I am not necessarily the best at it because I don't really play these kind of games. Like, I don't play H1Z1. I did play a bit of Ark, but it's been a while since I've played that. So, it's not necessarily my game type, but I am really enjoying it. So if this is something that's more up your alley, if you are into those kind of games like H1Z1 or Ark or anything like that, or were curious about it, but not necessarily enough to pick up those games, then this might be the thing to tip you over on the Division, because you have all that base content in the game, which is a lot of content, 1 to 30. The story is really great. And on top of that, if you picked up the expansion for it to get survival, Then you have the survival expansion in order to do the survival mode. So it's pretty cool. It's pretty fun. It's more fun with people. And the PvP mode just makes it that much more intense, especially when you find someone who isn't being very aggressive against you, isn't wanting to kill you, but you can just, there's something about them that makes you wonder, are they going to turn on me at any point? Because eventually we're going to have to turn on each other. When that will happen, it's going to be basically bloodshed all over the place. It's interesting. It's really cool. I would highly suggest it. But with all of that being said, we shall see you guys next time.